Hey guys, so we're here with our continued Ancient China Ed Puzzle notes. So this will go into a little more detail about some of the stuff that we talked about in the lecture notes before. So we start with the Great Wall, right? And we watched a documentary about it last week, if you recall, where they were kind of tracing the origins of the Great, excuse me, the Great Wall, and finding that it was built, or at least conceived as an idea, long before uh, historians had originally thought. Um, the documentary did go into some detail about why the wall was built. And basically, as our book says, and as we've gone over before, China was protected naturally by a lot of barriers like mountains and seas and rivers. But there was an area in the north that wasn't protected. And for quite some time, the people of the North were kind of victims of raiding parties riding in on horseback and coming in and destroying villages and towns and farms. And so the emperor at the time decided that they needed to build this one long continuous wall because there had been bits and pieces of walls built to protect the people, but they weren't connected, and so people could get through. And so they built the what becomes the Great Wall of China, um, and it's built entirely manually, right? Like this is built by soldiers and slaves and farmers and poor people, prisoners, to build it by hand, brick by brick, for thousands and thousands of miles. Um, as it stands today, upon completion, it's over 13,000 miles, which would be like flying or driving, flying, whatever, back and forth between New York and California like 5 times. And it's, again, built entirely by hand, by manual labor. So it's really, now it's this incredible tourist attraction and symbol of pride for Chinese culture and a symbol of the ancient dynasties. But at the time, it was built as protection to protect the Chinese mainland from outside invaders. And there's also some historians who have said that it was meant to keep people in as well. Um, we talked about how China was very isolated and had its own culture. And so if that's the case, you don't always want people leaving the land, spreading out. It just makes them harder to control. So if you have a wall kind of walling everybody in, keeping everybody in, it's easier to control the people. And as we know, the early dynasties were all about that kind of strict control, strict laws. And so this helped with that as well. Okay. Um, we'll skip this. I'll just read our text box over here. It says, on the morning of March 29th, 1974, farmers digging a well in a village near Xi'an, China, made an incredible discovery. They found a body, but one made of baked clay. It was one of an estimated 8,000 life-size terracotta or clay warriors that had been created to protect Xuanyang more than 2,000 years ago. The army of warriors and their chariots and horses stood in battle formation, ready to fight the emperor's battle in the afterlife. Historians estimate that more than 700,000 laborers worked for 38 years to complete the project around 209 BC. As wonderful as the warriors are, archaeologists believe even greater treasures lie in the emperor's tomb itself, which remains unexplored. Okay, so I mean, number one, these are just really impressive statues. You see how lifelike they are, but they're really symbols of the emperor's power, right? Um, he had people just build, he had over around 700,000 people building these statues to protect his tomb in the afterlife. And so, again, it's a symbol of the emperor's power and of the importance, those Confucianist beliefs in duty and honor and respecting the person who's higher up than you on the proverbial totem pole. Okay, so next we come to the Han Dynasty, which I talked about in our notes earlier today. The Han Dynasty comes to power in 202 BC, and remember these dynasties can last for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the dynasty that was started with Shi Huangdi, he passes it down to his son, but his son proves to be a weak ruler, and eventually, this peasant named Liu Bang seizes control and begins the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty is going to last for about 400 years. The things that characterize the Han Dynasty are one, they switch from a more legalist perspective. So they switch from like the hardline, uh, harsh rule to a more friendly rule. They give people more freedoms, and they're more about kind of personal duty and personal honor than they are about keeping people in line. Um, they develop a lot of roads and canals and irrigation like water systems, um, but I think the key thing to understand is they also developed this thing called a bureaucracy. You might have heard of a bureaucracy in American politics or in politics elsewhere in the world. A bureaucracy is basically it's like a group of people um, who are appointed by the leader to carry out different tasks. They're not elected officials. So, like in the United States, we have the IRS, which is responsible for writing the enforcing the tax code. We have the Department of the Treasury, which looks over money. Um, we have the Justice Department. All of these people who aren't elected, but who have like very specific jobs to carry out. And that's and the Han Dynasty had one of their own, which is really impressive at the time when you consider this is over 2,000 years ago to develop this really complicated system where different people have different jobs. Whereas before that, it was really the emperor, his soldiers, they kind of ran the show, but now they give more responsibility to other people. In terms of daily life, there were cities in the Han Dynasty, and these were places that had restaurants and businesses and like market stalls. But for the most part, Chinese people lived in villages and were peasant farmers, right? They to use the old phrase, they reaped what they sowed, right? Like they grew their own food, they made their own furniture, they provided for themselves, right? They had just enough to feed themselves and their families, and they lived on that, and they lived on that land. And so again, the Han Dynasty is kind of the first great Chinese dynasty. It lasts for about 400 years, and to this day, many Chinese people still call themselves people of the Han because this was kind of the golden age of the dynasties, where they just had a lot of great achievements. So speaking of achievements, um, they had many advances in science and technology and medicine. We know that they invented paper, which allowed for the written word to be spread around and for people to read more and for ideas to be spread and information to be spread. As we see to the left, the Chinese during the Han Dynasty invented the first compass. Um, they invented a lot of different farming tools, including the wheelbarrow and the plow, and a harness that would go around a horse's neck. And they also developed silk, right? And silk, which to this day is still like a very coveted textile, like a very coveted material, was invented by the Chinese. They developed and sort of mastered this process of creating silk, and they spread it throughout the whole world. Um, I mentioned the Silk Road in my sort of mini notes lecture, but the Silk Road was, I mean, it's not, it was a literal road that was traveled by traders from China to the Middle East to Europe, where they would spread out, where they would trade their goods and their silk and their iron. But it was also incredibly, incredibly important in the development of ideas, right? Like ideas being spread from the Middle East back to China, and from China to Europe, and from Europe to the Middle East, and so on. You had all of these people interacting with each other from different parts of the world. And it's kind of the first time that the world becomes more globalized, right? Like people really start to see what life is like in other parts of the world, and they borrow and change their ideas, and they change their ideas on how to make things and how to trade things, and um, on medicine and science, and that is all a result of um, Chinese silk, right? The demand, people really want this Chinese silk, and that's how they get it through the Silk Road. Okay, um, that is it for. As you see, the next section will get into the Silk Road. Um, but that's it for this section. So as always, feel free to go back and rewatch what you need to, and let me know if you have any questions. All right.